A function is a block of code that allows us to perform a specific task. In Python, as in most programming languages, we have built-in and user-defined functions. Let me give you some examples about built-in functions. So let's say we have a list S, and that list contains the numbers 1, 2, and 3. And what we would like next is to know the length of S, the number of items that S has. So we can use the built-in function len that stands for length, and that will give us the value 3. This is built in Python. We don't have to import any modules to get this, but there are some functions that come from different modules that we would have to import. So let me give you an example. I can import from the module math, I can import the square root function, and I can do, for example, the square root of 4, and I get the value of 2. Again, this performs this specific task. While the length function was built in the Python-based module, the square root function comes from the math module, and there might be some modules that also have the square root function, such as NumPy module. So again, many functions that are built in, many functions that come from specific modules, but it's important to know how to use them. Again, we can say from math import square root, or we could also import the whole math module and say then math square root of 4. And this is also a valid way to call specific functions that come from specific modules. Now, we could also define our own functions, and the way that we could do these is by using the def keyword. For example, if I say def, I'm defining a function, and the next thing that comes after the def statement is the function name. The function can take some parameters, or it doesn't have to. So for example, in this particular function, I'm not going to define any parameters. I'm just going to say this is what func1 returns. So now this function has been defined, and if I call this function, again, I didn't define any parameters inside, so I don't have to pass anything, then what the function returns is just this print statement. Now, we could know, if we wanted to check func1, you will see that this is a function that is in the main module that was just defined. Again, it's just a function because it just returns something. Okay. Now, in this particular case, we're not returning anything. We are just printing a statement. So if I do, for example, a is equal to func1, and I save this to a, what we'll see is that if we try to see what a is nothing. I mean, basically this function returned nothing. It's just printed something. If we want to return a specific value, then we have to use the return statement. So we could do something like this. Instead of saying print, we could return this value, and now if I say a is equal to func1, then a has this string attached. Now it's important to note that if we just say print, it will not save anything unless we say return this specific value. Now, functions can also have parameters. They can have one single parameter, multiple parameters. So let me give you an example. I'm going to define func2, and I'm going to have 2 positional parameters in there. So I'm just going to return a times b. Now what the function does is just returning the multiplication of a and b. So if I say func2 of 2 and 3, what this function is supposed to do is multiply these two numbers. Now, you could also annotate what these values should be, and although this has no specific function, I mean, it doesn't do anything, you can basically, for simplicity of whoever's reading the code, you can say, well, a is supposed to be an integer. What you do with the semicolon is annotate. It's basically just like a note of whoever's writing or reading the function know what these values should be. So you can say annotate these a and b and say that these values should be integers. So you can say return a and b, and basically what this does is the same thing. So if I do func 2 and 3, these basically, well, let's just return a times b. Let me just get rid of this. So it's basically the multiplication. Now, we annotated this and said that these are supposed to be integers, but that doesn't prevent us from using, let's say, a float value, and it doesn't create an exception or an error. This is just basically to annotate and give more information of what those values should be, but it doesn't prevent us from using something else. Now, it's important to know that functions basically can have parameters that are positional like this, but they can also have parameters that are keyword parameters. In other words, they you can set them to be specific values for default. So let me give you an example. So let's say have defined function 4, and I can say take a positional parameter, and I say b, and I put as default for b 10. And I'm going to return also, let's say, I'm going to return the addition of these two. What this function does is that it contains two positional parameters, but one of them is just, it has a default value. So if I say func4, I only need the value of a, because if I don't provide anything for b, what happens is that the default value for 10 is going to be used. So if I do, let's say, if a is equal to 4, then the addition is going to be 14 because it's going to use 10 as the default for that. Now, that doesn't prevent us from using two values. I could say 4 and 2, and what that will do is that will set the value of b to 2, and it's not going to use the default unless we specifically say that we don't assign any value to it. A lambda function is also a function, but we don't assign any specific name to it, and are generally used for very short one-line functions. Let me give you an example. So let's say I create func5, and I say lambda x. The notation, the way that we specify these is that this lambda statement is followed by the parameter. We use a column, and then we write the expression that we want to return. So basically, this takes a value x and returns x squared. So now I can assign this to this func5, but basically a lambda expression is used just to quickly write a one-line function that we don't necessarily have to create a function for it. It's the same. It also builds a function, but it's just mainly used for one-liners, very quick functions. So, in other words, this func5 is a function. Also, it's just it doesn't have any specific name, but and we did assign it to func5, but we don't have to. But it works exactly the same way as it would work if we use the def statement. Now, lambda functions are very useful, and we'll see later on how they are used. But it's important to know that these are also functions that could be used quickly if we have to.